A very warm welcome to all of you. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Adra Surendran, who will be giving the guest lecture today. Dr. Adra Surendran teaches at the Department of Liberal Arts at the Indian Institute of Technology, Hyderabad. Her key areas of interest are labor, development, social inequality and gender. She works at the intersection of sociology and social history of labor with a focus on public sector industry in India. Adra's training has been in development studies and sociology. She received a PhD from the Jawaharlal Nehru University and her doctoral work examined the dynamics of labor politics in a public sector industrial township. Adra has worked on several research projects. In today's presentation, she will present her empirical work on migration with a specific focus on the construction sector, which, as you know, employs a significant proportion of migrant workers in India who also happen to be circular migrant laborers. So over to you, Adra. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thanks to Amrita for the invitation. What I'm speaking about today is some joint work that I have done with Professor Carol Upadhyay at the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore. And this is a project that set out to examine migrant labor construction supply chains in the construction industry. And I'm excited to share some of these findings because we started out wanting to track the supply chain and we ended up kind of understanding that the very process of migration is extremely crucial in determining how these supply chains work and how the structures of profit accumulation within the construction industry are organized. So we began, at a slightly different point, and I think what we have to say is relevant to the course in general because it highlights how central migration, and particularly this variety of migration, is to several ongoing processes of development in our country, and particularly within the construction sector. The specific form of short-term circular migration is particularly important. So I'll just move on to my presentation. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is a larger project which was done by the two of us in the context of Bangalore. And this particular talk, we are choosing to call it Mobilizing Value, Migration and Labor Contracting in India's Construction Industry, hoping to highlight the fact that migration is central to the process of profit accumulation within how large-scale construction is undertaken in India. So just to give you a quick sense of the background of the project itself, or why we undertook the study. So as you know that, and this is something that Amrita would have spoken about at length as well, in the course, that the process of migration and its various sort of manifestations and the various scales at which it is happening currently in India has been closely linked to the fact of domestic development differentials, the fact that there are regional inequalities in development, there are massive inequalities in different regions' ability to create employment, create sustainable and decent work, etc., which has led to a series of different patterns of migration, which has been documented to some extent. Although scholars like Ravi Srivastava have also spoken about how our ability to document short-term circular migration in particular and capture it in its entirety is still sort of stilted, right? So there are renewed efforts to capture the entirety of this phenomenon in all its nuances that are happening. But having said that, generally, there is some scholarly consensus about the fact that the factors that lead to or have led to the acceleration of long distance circular migration, a lot of it short-term migration, have been the fact that there is widening regional inequality across the country. So as you know, there are sending regions which are primarily identified for the feature of the fact that they send out labor to mostly bigger cities in India, which have become the hubs for many of the rising opportunities for employment. And related to sort of what is happening at the sending end of this phenomenon, of course, is the crisis within agriculture, the fact that most of agriculture, unless it is large scale, is unviable, which has created a lot of related employment shifts, and migration has been an accelerated kind of corollary of these patterns, right? There's also some consensus on the fact that it's not as if these patterns have not historically existed. Like labor historians have also spoken about, some of these migrant chains migrant supply chains having been sort of older, etc. But what is crucially of note in what we see today is the the scale at which this kind of movement is happening, and the extremely fluctuating nature of short-term circular migration that we see. Now, related to why a lot of this migration is entering construction as an area of employment, of course, is the fact of the rapid growth of construction sector in India. It is, by many accounts, the third largest employer of labor in India outside of agriculture. And so it is a significant section of the Indian labor force that we're speaking about that is particularly migrating in this kind of way. So this is in some sense the background of the development differentials and how that is leading to, the particular kind of migration that we see in construction. And parallelly, if you look at the literature, especially the sociological literature on labor in construction, what you do see is that there is a focus on labor contractors as crucial agents, who are bringing in workers. So intermediaries have become sort of a crucial node to understand how labor supply is organized in these markets. However, what we discovered is that even while that literature exists, a lot of it, is dated in some sense, and some of it is also premised only on looking at the relationship between the labor contractor and the worker. Whereas, when we read extensively about it in other parts of the world, and also our fieldwork supports the understanding that what is needed is to understand the entire chain of labor mobilization, which means we also need to look at the business end of labor organization in construction, and try and understand how the business end, is crucially relevant to understanding how labor is mobilized. So it is no longer only a relationship between the contractor and the worker that needs to be understood if we want to understand how long distance short-term migration contributes to profit accumulation within the construction sector. So this is sort of broadly the kind of gap that we intended to address. And there is an emerging body of literature on intermediaries, sort of significantly led by David Pishery in the Indian context. But we do have some set of findings that are slightly at divergence from what Pishery is trying to argue. I'll come to that in just a bit. So the main research questions we began this project with was to want to try and understand the role of long-distance migration in labor supply and its influence on labor process within the construction industry in India. In other words, we are essentially trying to highlight that the very fact of long-distance short-term migration and the fact that it exists at scale within the construction industry is determinant of how labor process or how construction labor is deployed for constructing all these large scale buildings that we see around us, and it is crucially connected to how profit accumulation structures are designed. And so to do this, we have to focus on the modalities of surplus extraction by different actors in the value chain of labor recruitment and mobilization. So it's not, like I said, it's not enough for us to understand only the workers and the contractor, but a whole chain of actors above and below them. And I'm hoping to give a glimpse of that in today's talk. Now, this is crucially aided by what we're calling the entanglement of formal and informal labor relations and modes of organizational control. And what we mean by that is that large-scale construction in India is one of those industries where, at the organizational end, so if you look at big construction companies, developers, etc., you will see that these are heavily formally organized, extremely formally organized structures. Whereas if you look at the labor end, of the industry, you will see that they are massively informalized. So there is a certain coexistence of seemingly, organizations which are compliant to processes of labor law, to stipulations, of the labor regulation net framework, etc. on the one hand, and massively informalized, casualized mechanisms of labor recruitment and also modes of labor control at the other end. And these two structures are constantly in conversation with each other. And it is the sliding in and out of the formal and the informal that we are kind of trying to argue that makes the scale of profit extraction, profit accumulation possible in the context of labor within construction. And the intermediary in the form of the contractor is a very crucial node in that this person is, or this agent, this actor is both at the bottom end of the formality structure within the large organizations that represent sort of construction industry in India, and at the top end of the informality pyramid that then follows him, which is represented by labor. So we so just to kind of contextualize, what is the relevance of understanding the process of movement or mobility, and how has that been understood within sort of these relationships of how capital accumulates profits and so on and so forth. We are relying on the larger literature on labor geography. Some of this may already have been discussed, in your course, but we're focusing on some key nodes within this discussion, right? So the first one is the literature pioneered by Doreen Massey, Andrew Herod, etc., which talks about the fact that each production arrangement is unique in the sense that there is a particular uniqueness to the relationship, set of relationships that are established between capital in any given location and how labor responds to it, right? So in the larger literature in labor geography, this theme has been used to kind of understand issues like capital flight, etc. So for instance, in our context, why do companies decide to set up in particular locations, right? And how does labor respond to the fact that a company is setting up in that particular location, etc.? Labor geographers have argued that this has not only an effect on the particular sort of ways in which labor is incorporated into this production structure, but it also has an impact on things like larger geographies, so urban geographies, or even rural geographies in cases where they've looked at, for instance, the establishment of mines and so on and so forth. But the larger point being that space, or where does capital set up, an entity of production, and how labor responds to it, or how does labor choose to kind of come into work there or not come into work there, etc., are matters of crucial relevance to understand how capitalism operates in the contemporary sort of framework, right? And within this, in the Indian context, there is literature that is looking at some of the larger economic landscapes that shape the labor process. So, for instance, let us assume that capital sets up shop in a particular place. So, in this case, let's assume there is a large residential development plot in, let us say, Bangalore, which is our site, right? But how labor chooses to respond to this, in the sense of from where does labor come in to work in these areas, is also dependent on larger economic landscapes, which is how we return back to the question of economic inequalities, development differentials, and what are the regions that decide to send people to work in these areas, what kind of economic pressures and pulls necessitate these shifts, and so on and so forth, right? But our empirical context is what we've looked at in Bangalore is slightly different for two reasons. One is we're looking at construction, and in construction, what we observe is there is a presence of a shifting and irregular workforces. These are highly mobile workers who don't necessarily stick to one production location. So if you speak to construction workers, as we've done in this project, you will see that many of them have not necessarily worked in the same city year after year. There are workers quite significantly, who work in one city for 3 months in a year, go back to the village and then come back and perhaps work in a different city, or even in the same city in a different location, etc. So this is a highly fluctuating kind of process, and production locations are shifting as far as the workers are concerned. So as far as labor is concerned, the production location is not necessarily a fixed entity. Even if it is in the same city, it's highly likely that they may work in different sites on each subsequent visit. The other thing is that there are huge networks of intermediaries that are propping up the production process. Like I said, even though the companies themselves are highly organized. And this is not necessarily a classical imagination of one contractor who brings in 10 or 20 workers. We're not talking about gangs anymore because this is large scale construction. We are talking about a range of intermediaries. So even within contractors, they are very different in terms of the nature of contracts that they undertake. They're different in terms of the scale, in terms of the number of people they manage. Also in terms of the kind of profit generating arrangements they have with the construction company. So subcontracting is a very important and central feature of how work happens, and it's propped up by an elaborate network of intermediaries. We'll get into that in a little detail in what I have to say in what follows, right? So all of this leads us to kind of say that there have to be new understandings of the relationship between mobility right? The fact of migration, and in our case, this particular variety of migration, which is long distance, short term migration, and how that has an impact on how labor actually takes place, especially in the context of the global south. Now, what is useful in the specific context of construction in India is work by Anna Singh and Adam Sargent, who have looked at the labor subcontracting system in construction as an inverted supply chain. What they're trying to say is that typically, in most contexts, capital moves, right? So capital moves from point to point, or they set up factories in point to point, from point to point, and labor is more or less a fixed entity. In most other forms of production that we see, even if you're looking at global supply chains and so on and so forth. But in construction, the supply chain is better characterized as an inverted supply chain, in that the site of production is fixed in the sense of a particular construction site, but labor is constantly moving, right? So what is the impact of this on how this industry is accumulating profits? So this was the main kind of questions. These were the main questions that we started out with. So because we were interested in tracking this mobility, our research strategy necessarily needed to incorporate the fact that there are different actors in the contracting system, both across space, meaning we would have to move to track all the actors in this chain. We would have to move between the production sites or the destination sites, as well as the origin sites, or where the workers are coming from. And we also had to move across scale because we wanted to get a complete picture of the contracting networks at all levels within large-scale construction in India. And we also had to focus on mechanisms and relationships that structure both the recruitment of labor from the origin sites, their movement to the site of production, and all of this is dynamic, as I will demonstrate in a bit. And of course, once they reach the site of production, what are the processes of management? So our strategy had to capture all of these kind of moving parts, so to speak. And so the research design was kind of structured, keeping these ends in mind. And we did fieldwork at selected construction companies and sites in Bangalore. All of these are large-scale construction sites, because that is where this particular variety of migration, long-distance, short-term, individual male migration, sort of is seen most rampantly. Medium and small-scale construction patterns are slightly different, and we haven't looked at that in this particular study. And once we identified the construction companies and sites in Bangalore, what we did was we traced the workers back to the source regions in both Bihar and Jharkhand. So, we had our research team traveling with the workers and also independently to the source regions and villages that the workers come from to identify the other actors that are relevant in this movement. We also had our research team travel with groups of workers in trains on their way to Bangalore to understand what are the negotiations that are happening through the journey, etc. So essentially trying to capture all aspects of mobility in how labor deployment actually takes place in construction. And so, of course, this necessarily meant that our methods were open-ended. It's largely qualitatively informed, the study, and a lot of the fieldwork is ethnographic in its design. Let me move on to some of the findings, some of the ones that I wish to highlight, in the context of this course in particular. So the first one is, of course, the extremely fluctuating nature of this workforce, right? So in large-scale construction in urban India, this workforce is constantly turning over. These are a highly mobile group of workers who are recruited for short stints. They typically come in for 3 to 6 months. And they frequently circulate between home, village, and different cities, right? So the fluctuating nature of this is a key element of how large-scale construction in India is taking place currently. That is the main point. The sub-point that we wish to highlight there is, as a result of the fieldwork, what we have also managed to uncover is that the set of other actors who are sort of engineering production in construction, mainly site engineers, thekedars or contractors who are mobilizing these workers, and different gangs of workers themselves. So all three of these entities are also in a rotating roster, right? So engineers sort of on an average stick to particular companies for not more than 3 or 4 years, and they tend to move for upward mobility, for career mobility, etc., Thekedars also have a rotating roster of clients or companies that they're supplying workers to. And gangs of workers themselves are not necessarily tied to individual thekedars, even though they may be for short stints of time. But in the long run, what you see is all of these three sets of actors are moving constantly between companies, and in the long run between cities and sites, and so on and so forth. So there are many different moving parts to how labor is organized, managed, and recruited in large-scale construction in India. The second sort of sub-dimension of that, phenomenon is the multi-scalarity of these networks. What I mean by that is that even within large-scale construction, there are sort of contractors that operate at extremely sort of large levels. There are labor as well as supply contractors who supply close to 1,000, 1,500 workers in one city at any given point in time. They have sub actors in these supply chains that are managing workers across different sites, sometimes shuffling workers across different sites, etc. So at one end of the labor mobility structure are these actors, and then as we come down the pyramid, so to speak, what we do see are actors operating at smaller and smaller scales, right? So there are several levels of intermediate contractors who are supplying, let's say, 100 to 200 kind workers. They are internally differentiated in terms of skills. A lot of them supply unskilled workers. Some of them supply highly skilled workers. And the kind of contract relationships they have with the companies is also different in terms of the profit margins, in terms of the number of workers they're dealing with, and in terms of the distance from which they're bringing workers. And so the multi-scalarity and the networked kind of nature of this phenomenon is important to understand. The contractual arrangements themselves are internally very diverse. So when we typically think of a contractor and a construction company, we are not necessarily thinking of the possibility that there may be a wide variety of different types of contracts. And so the internal differentiation in the different, kind of contracts itself leads to different kinds of profit generating mechanisms for both the company as well as the contractor. And each of these arrangements are marked by different levels of formality and different levels of what we're calling sociality, meaning different levels of mobilizing, relationships of kinship, community, village ties, etc., in controlling labor. Which leads for us to kind of understand or acknowledge that there is a large internal diversity in scale and type of contracting. So just to quickly give you an example, the two basic types of contracting we see currently have to do with what are called measurement-based contracts and labor supply-based contracts. So measurement-based contracts are when contractors undertake the responsibility for a part of production in its entirety. Right. So what this means is that the contractor is entering an arrangement into the company for finishing a certain part of the construction labor process. This could be form work. This could be, tiling. This could be sanitary ware. This could be wiring, electrical work, etc. But you are entering a contract for the completion of a quantum of work. So the number of workers the contractor brings in order to finish this quantum of work is not necessarily the company's lookout or interest, right? This is very different from labor supply contracts, where the contracts are designed on the basis of the number of workers that the contractor will bring in. So naturally, because the nature of these contracts are different, the profit accumulation mechanisms are different for both the contractor as well as the company in how they are using this entanglement of formality and informality to extract profit out of workers. But across the board, what we do see, of course, is that the workers are promised a certain wage on paper, but that is on paper, meaning between the company and the contractor, but that is almost always not what the workers do get paid. And this gap is typically what accounts for profits in the case of labor supply contracts. And in case of measurement contracts, of course, the contractor is also extracting profit out of a number of other things like cost of raw materials, and so on and so forth. But the framing narrative of informality is very crucial for all of these systems to work, right? So the absence of written contracts, the absence of adherence to labor laws, the perpetuation of these mechanisms through orally spoken word kind of understandings is what is propping up this entire bottom end of the labor supply, into construction, so to speak. It is also aided by the fluidity of labor contracting systems. So, for instance, A contractor's ability to quickly move workers from one construction site, let's say in Bangalore, to another construction site in the same city is very crucial if they have to meet some of these production targets. So this, how the system operates necessarily means that labor will be moved from site to site, and it's kind of worked into how a construction labor is organized, particularly within the given city. So a fluidity in the labor contracting system, the contractor's ability to quickly move workers, the engineer's ability to quickly mobilize workers, by getting in touch with contractors, all of this becomes central to how production targets are met within construction. And in what follows, we are going to say that what this leads to is a certain messiness in how labor is controlled in these sites. But before we get there, I just want to highlight the core relationships in labor mobilization, or how does this labor mobilization actually take place, right? So at the village end of the process, or at the source end of the process, there is, from our fieldwork, what we gather is that there is the establishment of a relationship between the thekedar, the contractor, and families of workers in the village. And several contractors sort of highlighted the fact that there is the establishment of a relationship with the workers' families. There is an establishment of legitimacy by visiting in person at least once, so that, as I quote, they know this is not some random person who has come to take their boys away. It is important that they know if there is some problem tomorrow, they can come to my house. So in the fieldwork, we also had contractors sort of listing the various strategies in terms of giving, a copy of their ID cards, or having meals, with the families, telling them, giving them his address so that he can be tracked, establishing certain responsibility structures. Now, the fact that there are relationships being established with the families speaks to another body of literature about social reproduction that is emerging in the Indian context, in the post-pandemic context, which looks at how systems of migration are propped up no longer by the individual worker who comes into the city to work, etc., but by an expanding network of relationships with the workers' families, the larger networks of kin, in the workers' village, etc., etc. This is something that is important and interesting, but I'm not going into that right now. There is also the relationship between the thekedar and the village mobilizer, who is the sort of was described as the unofficial HR person in the village. So this is the person that is stationary in the village, who is constantly looking out for the workers who are willing to travel long distances, and also travels with them, with the gang, into the destination areas, and gathers information during this journey, partly also to make sure that the workers don't desert this particular contractor, because there were instances of that happening also more frequently than we would imagine. But the mobilizer also gathers information about going rates, in different sites, what are different contractors paying for different kinds of skills. There is information exchange in terms of phone numbers. All of these kinds of details are sort of also gathered. But the relation between the thekedar and this entity that is situated in the village, we found, was very crucial in propping up many of these systems of mobility. Now, at the destination site, right, once the workers reach the destination site, the crucial relationships seem to be between the site manager, who's a site engineer, who's in charge of production in a particular site, and the thekedar, who's immediately from the company's end in charge of controlling the project. Now, what was interesting here is that the site manager is, in most instances, of the most importance to the contractors compared to people above them in the hierarchy. We found that the site manager, cultivates lists of contractors and attempts to kind of keep them with him more frequently. And when they move from one company to the other, they typically take the contractors that they've cultivated with them, and they establish new relationships with new companies, etc. Giving us a hint on how labor control takes place on these projects. It's important also for the site manager to have a certain extent of influence over the thekedars that he's bringing into his site, because they are the ones who will ultimately manage whether the production targets are met, etc. So the site manager is given utmost importance, and the relationship between the immediate site manager and the thekedar is extremely core in how labor mobilization takes place. Now, at the level of the thekedar, they tend to have site supervisors who are typically chosen on the basis of their familiarity, loyalty, etc., with the contractor. And the supervisor is the on-site manager as far as the contractor's operations on any given site is concerned. This is the person that keeps in charge of, keeps a track of working hours, the number of workers on any given site, manages payments, he manages sort of the distribution between what workers are given for day-to-day expenses and what is getting deposited into their accounts, etc. And the supervisor frequently also tends to speak the language of the workers that the Thekadar is mobilizing workers, the area from which the Thekadar is mobilizing the workers. So for all intents and purposes, actual on-site management and control of workers takes place through the supervisor, and the Thekadar frequently visits only once a week, typically on the weekends, to oversee and manage production activities. Then there is, of course, the relationship between the Thekadar and the worker, which is crucially determinant on village ties. There are relationships of kinship, of regional solidarities, which are understood to be very central. There is a quotation here where the contractor says, if they are from my village, it is a contract in itself. If we don't pay them, they will catch us in the village. So there are sort of relationships of patronage, of course, but also relationships with reverse pressure that is brought in because of the fact that workers are from the same village as the Thekadar, etc. But we also found evidence of a lot of Thekadars who have started expanding their base areas. So they started recruiting from adjacent districts, which requires the mobilization of another network of village mobilizers and supervisors, etc. There are also contractors who mobilize from more than one state. And in these are the cases where they visit the villages to kind of establish their presence, and so on. But all of these relationships are extremely crucial in mobilizing and managing labor. So in the light of what I've just said, the third sort of key finding is that there are shifting modalities of how labor is controlled on construction work sites and how the production process actually takes place, right? So we are trying to move away from the classical imagination where we believe that, all the workers on a given construction site will listen to the top person from, let us say, a construction company, who's in charge of that site. But what we find empirically is that is really not how this works. So the fluidity of the workforce, right? The fact that workers are coming and going at a rapid rate, that workers may come in for a few months, they may agree to come in for a few months, but may leave before the agreed period gets over. Workers may come in and pocket the first month's sort of remuneration, but then decide to not work for the construction, for the contractor. They may go back. Workers may also come back to the same contractor, repeatedly for the same kind of work. So there is a certain fluidity. One can't be sure what percentage of a gang of workers that have been brought into a construction site will actually stay on and finish the quantum of work that they agreed to undertake. Now, this seems to be sort of commonplace as an understanding across the board, in large-scale construction in India. The workers themselves are operating on this idea that we will come in and we may choose to leave when we want to. The contractors are operating on the basis of the idea that if I mobilize 20 workers, maybe 10 or 12 or 15 of them may end up working. So they're already working in the fact that 5 of them may not end up, being on the site. Similarly, the site engineer, the project manager are all operating on the basis of the understanding that labor availability is a fluctuating thing. And therefore, they set production targets based on the fact that labor availability and labor crunch will continue to happen. And this will necessarily cause delays. So this is sort of, one aspect of how, the fact of mobility is worked into the production process in construction in terms of targets at all levels. The second is that because the supervisor on site, we found, is the person that workers typically listen to, our understanding that, site engineers and sort of higher representatives of the company have any remarkable control over workers is not necessarily true. What we are increasingly seeing is that site engineers are typically dealing only with the supervisor or maybe the Thekadar in getting them to instruct the workers on completing certain tasks. And the supervisors and the contractors in turn are using different kinds of incentivization strategies to encourage workers to finish tasks on time. So there is a distancing of the company and the management from the production process, Very often we found that workers were not aware of or did not care what is the larger company that they're working for, and they frequently understood the labor relationship as something that only primarily existed between them and their contractor, mediated by their supervisor. This is important to understand also because a lot of the policy responses to for protection, social protection of migrant workers, etc., involves the ability, of workers to identify who their principal employer is, and doesn't necessarily look at the contractor or the intermediary as relevant in this entire phenomenon. But what we see unfolding on the ground is that workers themselves are not very mindful of who the larger company is, and the production process is also organized in such a way that it distances the worker from the actual principal employer. This has large-reaching impacts, wide-ranging impacts on how the policy protection mechanisms are designed for this class of workers. And management, of course, because they know that the extent of control that they can exert over workers is shrinking, they have devised a series of other kinds of strategies to exert pressure on the tekkedars, typically in terms of threatening to cancel the work order, or threatening to not give them a subsequent work order, etc., etc., changing the profit margins, and so on and so forth, which are the strategies that are deployed by capital. Now, on the whole, the impact of all of this on what we see on site is that older or more direct or confrontational styles of labor control are less evident on the work sites. You do not see, people sort of yelling down the chain of command in construction work sites. In a lot of the interviews and narratives, there is a repeated importance of good behavior, that is highlighted in how workers can be managed on the site, the importance of tact, etc., in handling the workers, both at the level of the supervisor and the tekkedars, and of course, the importance of tact in handling the supervisors themselves at the level of the company's representatives, on the work site. So you do see the decline of older sort of styles of labor control, or our understanding of more despotic styles of labor control. They seem to not be in operation in the sites that we examined in the very least. And the last dimension that we wanted to highlight is that in terms of the impact of the highly fluctuating nature of labor mobility within large scale construction, is that we also see a dilution of the conventional understanding of how labor contracting operates, right? And it's an understanding that is based on a patronage kind of relationship. It is the understanding that the labor contractor establishes a relationship of patronage with the workers, typically through advancing a cash advance, which establishes a relationship of debt bondage. And therefore, the relationship between the tekkedar and the worker has typically been understood, and it empirically also was true at a certain point in time, in terms of the kind of constraints that this debt labor relationship establishes. But what we have found across sites that we examined in Bangalore is that workers, even in the case where they do take a cash advance, we did find a number of instances of desertion in terms of workers taking a cash advance and deciding to not work for that contractor. There are instances of poaching where rival contractors, do take workers away. And all of this is happening after the worker has taken a cash advance. And contrary to our understanding, most contractors seem to be reporting that there aren't too many ways in which the money can be earned back if you give a cash advance to a worker. We also found that typical relationships of patronage in terms of loyalty, in terms of workers sticking to the same contractor over a long period of time, etc., is not the case. So most of the workers we've spoken to have worked with different contractors over different periods of time. They have switched when the working conditions were better or when more money was offered. So relationships of loyalty based on kin obligations or village obligations were present, but they were not really dominantly characterizing the relationship between the worker and the tekkedar. So tekkedars are also aware of the possibility that workers may leave at any point in time. There is no agreement, like the tekkedar says here, between workers and us for how long they will work. It is an open-ended kind of arrangement. If they have some work at home, they will leave, right? So the flux is worked into, of course, tekkedar's calculations also of how many workers have to be brought in at a particular point in time, and on an average, how long are they likely to stay. We also do see workers also express this relative freedom in terms of their ability to change jobs or contractors. And we do have a number of workers. I've pulled up a couple of instances here where workers have explained that if we don't like the work, we do choose to leave. And this is also because of the flux in the labor force. It's mostly because the workers are aware that the opportunity to come back to look for work, a similar kind of work in the same city, in a different site, find a different contractor, etc., do exist, because these networks are fairly well established at this point in time. So they say that we are laborers, we can go and work anywhere. We also found evidence of workers finding ways in which they can recoup their money in case where contractors have not paid them, and so on and so forth, which are also tied to the fact that these mobilization chains also depend on workers themselves bringing in more workers. So the contractor is constantly asking the existing workers to see if there are other workers that they can mobilize to join the gangs, and so on and so forth. And therefore, there is always the possibility that individual workers can speak to contractors, ask them to give them an advance to be given to certain workers that they're bringing in, etc., and then pocket that money, and not pay back the contractor. Now, the interesting thing here is that even in instances where this happen, we have workers as well as contractors both telling us that there is no retribution in the way that in which we classically understand debt bondage. There is no retribution in the sense of thekadars wanting to chase after individual workers to recoup the money, and so on and so forth. Typically because this is a fluctuating labor force that is being managed. Thekadars don't have the time to chase after individual workers to kind of recoup small amounts of money. And so the flux also adds to how it then also enables the dilution of some of these strong relationships of patronage that were previously established in the literature. So I'm going to wind up now, right? So I hope I have been able to give you a glimpse into some of the thematics that we have been concerned with, which we have tried to organize along two main kind of lines of discussion here. One is, of course, the fact of the highly mobile, nature of this workforce, this workforce in constant flux. To establish that fact in one case in how large-scale construction happens in India, and then to establish the impact of that flux on how labor processes in construction are organized, that these processes are designed to manage the constantly fluctuating labor force from the very top of the construction companies that are recruiting these contractors that they strike these work arrangements with, all the way down to various levels along which labor contractors and other agents mobilize these workforces. Everybody is accounting for this flux. Everybody is accounting for the fact that these workers are highly mobile, and at each stage, the fact of their mobility is also worked into profit accumulation mechanisms. I haven't paid a lot of attention to that in this presentation, but this is something also that we're trying to develop. The second sort of sub point is that systems of labor control are crucially dependent on labor market intermediaries and are designed to accommodate this flux again, right? So large construction companies have sort of outsourced the process of labor control itself to the labor market intermediaries who are bringing in workers. They're not directly in charge of controlling the labor that is undertaking most of this construction. And therefore, systems of labor control are also designed to accommodate the fact of their constant movement, right? This is also both at the level of the companies as well as at the level of the contractors. I'll be happy to explain some of this if we have the time for questions. And of course, finally, the close entanglements of the formality, in the form of compliance requirements that the government establishes for the companies, etc. on the one hand, and the rampant informality that you see in how workers are brought in and managed is what forms the backdrop to how this mechanism actually works, right? It wouldn't work in the way that it currently is if it hadn't been organized along the lines of formality and compliance on certain aspects of construction process on the one hand, and the actual presence of informality, which is aided by of course mechanisms of labor recruitment and control, but also aided by the inability of state labor departments to be able to sort of visit these sites and undertake frequent inspections to make sure that laws are followed, the inability of our welfare mechanisms to ensure that workers are registered. So informality contributes to all of these kinds of precarities that it sort of exposes these workers to, and it is a combination of the presence of both of these sets of features that is propping up how large-scale construction is happening, in India. And the second sub-point we're trying to make is about labor management systems, labor control mechanisms, that this highly mobile, informal, and temporary workforce then requires management systems which are not concerned with productivity as we are conventionally understanding it. So I don't know if you've observed this about large-scale construction in India, but the production targets are almost never met. Right. So if a construction project is set to be completed at a certain point in time, it invariably exceeds the deadline by about a year and a half, sometimes even more. And this is particularly so in case of residential construction and so on. And this is largely because the production targets that are set by the company, is frequently gets shifted because of the fluctuating labor force and the complications involved in mobilizing and maintaining a labor force that will help meet the production targets. And so capital or the companies have now started working that into the kind of targets that they're setting for themselves, formally as well as informally. And so they're not operating with, yardsticks of productivity as we would conventionally sort of understand them. Now, at the labor end, these labor control mechanisms require the concrete reliance on social relations, which are rooted in what is called culture. We can break that down. We're not saying that it is a black box that can't be understood further. It can be very concretely understood, broken down in terms of caste relationships, ethnic ties, kinship, recruitment mechanisms, etc. Relationships of identification with a certain region, with a certain community, with a certain language, etc. And of course, crucially, relationships of trust and belongingness, because there is almost never anything on paper. So the intermediaries are running these labor supply chains on the basis of their own understandings of what is trust, their own understandings of what does it mean to make a worker feel like they belong, and so on and so forth. But finally, what we've tried to highlight is also that all of these allegiances are increasingly dynamic and instrumental. Nothing is set in stone. We constantly see, each of these relationships shifting depending on immediate concerns. Some of them may be wage related, some of them may be working relationships or working conditions related. And all of it together is pointing to a weakening of the traditional patronage relationships that we have identified in literature. So essentially what we're trying to say here is that all of these shifts that we observe in both the mobilization, transport, management of long distance, short-term migrant workers in large-scale construction in India, as well as their actual management on construction sites, all the shifts that are happening across these processes have to do with the particular kind of migration and the fact of their high mobility, and the fact of the constant fluctuation that characterizes this workforce is what is bringing about a lot of the shifts that we're seeing here. And in another part of the project, we're also arguing that the policy response to these shifts, along with a whole bunch of other scholars who are saying the same thing, haven't necessarily worked that into how we are attempting to design social protection mechanisms for this highly fluctuating class of workers. So the fact of the flux is not adequately incorporated into how labor is mobilized, labor is managed, how profits are generated, or how labor protection mechanisms, social protection mechanisms are designed for this workforce. So this is largely what I wanted to share with you today. I think I'll kind of stop there. So this research was funded by 2 grants given to us by the Azim Premji Foundation and the Indian Council for Social Science Research. I'd also like to thank our research team, Rohit Bisht, Vikas Kumar, and Sachin Kumar, who have done fieldwork for us at very crucial points within this project. And yeah, I think I'll wind up there, and I'm happy to answer questions if there are. Thank you.
Thanks, Adra. Thanks so much for, taking us through your very rich empirical ethnographic work and locating construction in wider development processes in India. And that's how you began, and that's so important, right? And really, you not only did you look at the nitty-gritties and nuances of the supply chain, but also specifically looking at construction labor per se. And, and this your long distance, short term migration stream, which is, of course, it's really fascinating whether we look at it theoretically and conceptually, but also the fact that they're going to multiple destinations, right? And that, that it's essentially a rural workforce. So I wanted to ask you in terms of, in terms of caste composition of this workforce, are there, could you tell us a little bit more about who the construction workers are, and then I just have a couple of more questions. But really fascinating talk. Thanks.
So let me just take you through the sort of the nature of the data, right? So we have spoken to over 100 workers in different construction sites, and the caste composition we have found is corresponding to what levels of skills in the industry that they work in. So unskilled workers who typically work as cleaners, movers, etc. on construction sites largely tend to be Dalit or tribal. So there is an overwhelming correspondence of these two categories in the 100-ish workers that we've spoken to over 3 to 4 years that we've done fieldwork on this project for. And as we move up the skill hierarchy, we find that skilled workers, masonry workers, farm workers, etc., belong to largely the OBC category. They tend to be, also caste in terms of the correlation between that and asset holding, etc. They also tend to be small or marginal farmers. They have small plots of land when you move up the skill hierarchy. And a lot of contractors, also tend to belong to the OBC or dominant caste categories. And they obviously are people that are starting out with larger initial assets in terms of land in the village or their ability to mobilize other kinds of capital. So I would say broadly the correspondence in terms of skill is there's a massive accumulation of Dalit and tribal workers at the unskilled end, or even at the lower levels of the skill hierarchy when they're going to move 1 or 2 levels up. And within the skilled end, what we see typically is a concentration of OBC workers who are small and marginal workers, farmers. Sorry.
Yeah, so that's also what the NSS data also very clearly shows, that construction work is dominated by Dalit and Adivasi workers. So therefore, in very many contexts, it's they come from very distressed situations, and you also emphasize the fact that this is largely a rural workforce. So I was very fascinated by the point in the end about how workers seem to have a lot of agency, right? So a lot of these conventional theories or ways of looking at bondage don't really apply, because, and this, we can argue whether it's bondage or not and so on. So, So do we then find like this is, we have on the one hand, there is some kind of enhanced labor agency than perhaps earlier, but at the same time, there's enhanced precarity of certain kinds. So do we find that kind of a paradox emerging? Because all of this, especially in the context of the flux that you mentioned.
In the sense that it is a paradox, but I think, what Carol and I think sort of in general also is that there are certain ways in which agency has been understood, particularly in the context of labor. And a lot of it involves, the ability of the workers to sort of collectivize, argue for certain kinds of rights, and sort of also then create terms that are more advantageous for them on a lasting long-term kind of basis. Now, what is different in this empirical context is that none of this exists, right? Opportunities for collectivizing are absent. None of the trade unions have touched this class of workers or are even attempting to. Which is also kind of then affected by the flux, right? Workers themselves are also aware that the possibility of doing this long term or coming back to the same site, etc., is really also not there. They may be also responding to several kinds of immediate, pulls and pressures. So what that leaves us with is we are sort of choosing to think of agency then as the ability to modulate or control your individual kind of working conditions and relationships and so on and so forth. And which is why we find also that, the ability to switch over to another contractor the moment there is higher pay, etc. And all of these strategies that workers have to make sure that they get the best sort of in that sense deal. Those seem to be the manifestations of agency, right? And also the confidence that workers have that there is no bondage in how we classically understand that term, even if you may have taken advance. And this is also, like I was saying, it's tied to the fact of flux. It is tied to the fact that I can go from here, even if I'm traced, there's really not much that the contractor will do, because the contractor is not going to expend that kind of energy to chase me down and get this money back, etc. So the flux is also contributing to what workers think is possible for them as individual agents. An agency, of course, is then, is shaped by the limits of possibilities that they themselves understand. So it is definitely a paradox in that it is highly precarious. But our general reading is that that precarity is not something that workers are sort of, what do I say, bothered by. It is something that they worked into, how they're managing their work lives and their annual trips. And, they figured their workarounds for accommodating this precarity, or at least how that's what they have been saying.
No, that's really, I mean, empirically, such new insights are coming from this work. And, just a couple of questions. So, in the course, we're also looking at rural-urban migration, right, which is so closely linked with urbanization, descriptive development, and so on and so forth. But when you have this kind of a workforce, right, which has no allegiance to destination, given the way the work is structured, like you showed, and so on. So what implications, does this have for, India's development project, our urbanization story, and so on?
So the third part of, this, we looked at a couple of things, but the third part, which I haven't spoken about today here, is really trying to understand whether the fact of this sort of the flux and the fact of this, high rates of mobility for this workforce has been factored into any sort of policy response, for migration. Even while there are discussions about mainstreaming migration in policy, etc., we have these initiatives for digitalization, and so on and so forth. But our general sort of reading is, particularly in the context of our data, is that flux is not adequately worked into how, our policy structures are imagining how this migration is taking place. And therefore, we still have, I mean, we have things to say about the larger question you asked, but particularly in terms of our immediate response, which also post-COVID, there is a lot of attention paid to the fact of what is happening to migrant workers who come into our cities and so on. And a series of responses have been launched. But any of those attempts at both data capturing through digitalized mechanisms or the various stimulus sort of packages that have been launched, etc., whether any of them adequately understand the motivations and structure of this workforce is something to really, really seriously kind of think about, right? So the data gathering exercise doesn't seem to adequately be sensitive to the fact that these are constant workers in constant flux. So even the, eShram database, which is a significant effort in itself, but however, doesn't account for the fact that the workers may move, from one point to another point in the same year, etc. So unless the worker is constantly updating this information and sort of mobilizing the technical literacy to do this, or finding an intermediary to do this, etc., particularly for migration, that unorganized worker database may not give us the kind of results that we are intending. And so if the database is incomplete, how will the social protection mechanism, which is supposed to be linked to that, will respond to that, is sort of, one question. Now, the other is that even the other kind of responses from different state governments, for instance, when the COVID, movement happened, the exodus of workers and then walking back, etc., happened, a lot of it is also based on the idea that, workers would like to stay in their source regions, etc. So a lot of the initiatives are about rural employment generation, rural industry creation, strengthening of employment guarantee schemes and all of this kind of thing. But from the field work, it is not our sense that workers do want to kind of stick to the villages, etc., because none of those schemes and sort of employment generation schemes and all of the Jharkhand is launched, Bihar is launched, Odisha is launched, etc., they simply don't match, the kind of, the wage differential is crazy. The wage differential is quite significant in terms of how, what they're managing to earn in the city, etc. So why is there the policy assumption that workers would invariably want to stay in the village for the long term is a question. It's not clear why that seems to be the dominant assumption, whereas the empirical realities are really kind of indicating something else altogether. We have to accommodate this flux as a central development process, in designing policy, in designing responses. If we keep thinking in terms of, wanting to keep the rural populations in the countryside, etc., that doesn't correspond to anything that we're seeing in India's development process currently. And this is not only about construction, it's about migration in general, as you would, of course, agree with as well. So,
no, absolutely, absolutely. And then eventually, because our cities are so exclusionary, and because, despite the wage differential being so high, but it's the wages, absolute wages are so low for them to be able to kind of bring their families in the city or imagine any kind of a permanent resettlement. So the reality of their lives is that they spend the majority of their working lives in the city only to go back to the village. And that really is the political economy of circular migration in India. And right. So thanks, Adra. I mean, I think this really kind of, what you covered today, it's pretty much, from the new economics of labor migration to livelihoods to, migration infrastructure, migrant networks, covered a broad range of concepts and theories that the students are doing in this course. So I think this empirical work will be very useful for their understanding. And also, thanks for taking us through the process of your research. So we have some students who might be engaged in research projects. So that would be particularly helpful. So we're grateful to you for taking your time out and doing this with us. Thank you
for having us, both Carol and I. And it was exciting to share because this is up and coming work. And it's very grateful for the opportunity to speak to an audience that is interested. And I'm glad that our empirics kind of spoke to some of the concepts and theories that you have covered so far. So thank you.
Okay, thanks. So that was Dr. Adra Surendran sharing the results of the findings of very, very recently undertaken empirical work on construction labor, migrant construction labor in India. And you can see the work was rich empirically. It was ethnographic work located in the wider processes of India's development. And so what's really interesting, you can see in the research process how they looked at the entire supply chain of construction and then located the migrant worker within the supply chain, right? And it also tells us about the specific stream of migration, long distance, short term migration, which largely has Dalit workers, Adivasi workers located at the very bottom of the labor hierarchy. And as you saw very clearly that this is a predominantly rural workforce that is working in multiple destinations, largely in urban areas, right? So this is then by definition, it's a circular kind of a workforce where migrant workers are spending much of their lives in different urban destinations or in different locations within the same urban destination and then eventually returning back to the village. So, it speaks to the theories that you've studied of the new economics of labor migration, theories of livelihoods, also migrant networks, how important migrant networks are, along with migration infrastructures. And what is also really, fascinating about this work is that research was done in both destination areas and source areas. And like we've spoken in the course, right? It's very important that we understand migration from both source and destination perspectives. And this is one of the very few studies which looks at migrants in both source and destination, because very often studies look either in the source region or in the destination region. And so with that, we come to the end of this lecture, and I'm sure you have enough food for thought. Thank you.